Already asked me to make some comments, and then I will ask the panelists to make one final recommendation. What we have seen so far, I think, has been focusing on two aspects. On one hand, the need to adopt or even develop technologies that help us identify certain speech patterns across platforms, or the example of Think Twice was mentioned, that is aimed at dissuading people from posting comments which are not appropriate. And on the other hand, the need for moderation, so human beings which requires resources within media house, it requires additional staff, as the current practice tends to leave this task to journalists, which actually forces journalists to be confronted directly even more with content that generates, that causes psychological distress. So I think these are the two core issues that we have been looking at. I know there is a comment from Cecile and one from Becky, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Very good. I think it's very interesting to sit here, and I'm so happy that you know, this is a subject to be discussed in such an important fora, because you know, when you get a lot of bad emails and things, it's like, you know, it was mentioned here to have an alcoholic problem, you know, it's like you don't really want to share it with anybody. So at my work, I never talk about this, very, very rarely. So very interesting that also other people say that the bosses at one's organization don't know what's really going on, because you don't want to bother them with this. People will say that, okay, if you are a journalist, you have to go with what comes. But want just to mention 2 or 3 issues of solutions, because at my job, NRK, the information department, not my bosses, but the information department said that we have to deal with this. So if there is a problem, you just come to us. And then what happened last year, there was a guy wrote a very, very bad tweet about me that was, you know, really making difficulties for my work. And then I called him and I said, what do you know about me? Why are you tweeting this? You know, I'm very angry with you. And he got very, very upset, very shocked. And then he wrote me an SMS that, in fact, I really like your reports. So, you know, I just came out a bit wrong in this tweet, and he'd been tweeting something really bad, so I think he just got nervous. I wrote about it on Facebook, and then the newspapers picked it up, and they wrote about it. So I think that's a very good thing, to confront the harassers and to show that, you know, they can be reached. They can be reached. They are risking something. But also the information department in NRK, they contacted 2 new female correspondents, and they had meetings with them, and they said that if you have problems, come to us. Because what happened with Cecile, me, last summer, was shameful for NRK. We don't want this to happen again, that she's all alone. So this is very good. The other thing was last summer, you know, we had this big debate about harassment, and I think the biggest problem is the young Norwegian Muslim bloggers and journalists, because they really get it both ways. They get racist harassment, and I think also they get something from their own communities, very much Norwegian Pakistani community. So they have disappeared. Many of these voices have disappeared. This is a problem. But what our Prime Minister did, Erna Solberg, which is a female Prime Minister, she invited a lot of the female journalists and bloggers who had this problem. And this was so important. I mean, I wasn't there, but this was such an important meeting, because our Prime Minister made this you know, a just cause. She talked about it in the open, which was very, very important for us who are very ashamed about being shamed. So this was a great help. Just want to mention one more thing, which I discussed in the coffee break. There was a lot of nasty, nasty comments on the internet about the Syrian refugees. And VGTV, it's a newspaper that has online television. They were calling people who were posting the most horrible racist remarks, and there was a big debate. Should these harassers or racists be protected against themselves? Should they be called up to talk about this officially? But then they had posted officially under their whole name. So what I just want to say is that I think it's a good thing to be for the harassers and the haters and the trolls to know that there is a risk that somebody might call them and make them responsible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giselle. Becky.
Hi, yeah, so I just wanted to come back actually at what Gavin was saying and then Sarah's response to that, because it was really interested me. When at The Guardian, I often had experiences where people who were not journalists got a lot of shit below the line. And that does raise particular problems, I think, and shouldn't be left out of this discussion. I think there was 2 examples popped into my head while you were talking. One was, there was a time a guy called Jimmy Mabenga, I don't know if anyone remembers him, but he was a failed asylum seeker, as far as I remember, who was deported, and on the plane leaving Britain, he was killed by the guards who were taking him. And it was a sort of big scandal. Still nobody's been charged for it. And his wife wrote a piece for Comment is Free, and in it she talked about her grief and her children's loss. I mean, it was a really, really sad piece. You know, the kind of piece where you read it and you just think, no one's going to respond to this except with sympathy and tears. You know, it got the most terrible abuse, but sort of racist, anti-immigrant, anti-asylum seeker kind of abuse. I don't think we can just wash our hands of that kind of thing. I think we have to take responsibility for that. But then, on the other hand, I also don't think we shouldn't publish those kind of first-person things, because another example that came into my head was a piece we wrote by a woman who'd done a lot of self-harming in her life, and she wrote a very powerful piece explaining all of that, how she, you know, explaining that. And she got one of the most beautiful, empathetic threads I've ever seen. It was just amazing. There was kind of over 1,000 comments and everybody pitching in with either their own stories or helping her, or, I mean, it was just extraordinary. So what my feeling is that we have to take responsibility for what does happen. When it goes wrong, we have to take responsibility for that. But we need to get much better at understanding about what it is about our journalism that sometimes triggers really bad reactions and sometimes doesn't. And I don't think we really understand that yet. And I think a lot of the sort of journalistic practices of going for very sensational things or kind of shocking things or actually maybe need to be adapted for the new era we find ourselves in. Maybe we need to write in a slightly different way sometimes. I don't know what the answers are, but I do think I don't think the answer is not to publish testimony, because I think it can be very powerful. That was one thing I wanted to say, and just the other thing I want to say was just pick up on Brittany's point about, you know, law isn't nuanced, code isn't nuanced, isn't neutral, sorry. And I think it's really important that we remember that these things are quite powerful tools we're talking about inventing, you know, and if you come up with something that recognizes certain kind of speech and automatically deletes it, or these are quite powerful things, and so we really need to have a lot more discussion about exactly what it is we're trying to stop and why we're trying to stop it. And I think sometimes as journalists we can underestimate the fact that we do have power, we do have a platform, we do have a voice, and it might not feel like that when you're getting a lot of abuse, but it's important to remember it, and that was all.
Thank you very much for that. I think there is one more comment there.
I have a comment related to some of the discussion of technical measures that has occurred. I think that technical measures to minimize the effect of the impact of negative comments, of abuse and so forth, certainly that can't be overstated, but I think there is also value in considering mechanisms that reduce the prevalence of that type of comment to begin with. And the discussion of moderation certainly led in that direction. There are various different sorts of abuse and motivations for abuse, but the storms of significant and focused abuse around one person are not always related to some sort of specific criticism of that person, but are a competition amongst the abusers to see who can be most abusive, because that's the mechanism by which social status is accrued in that area. And a lot of the quite successful counter-speech programs have been about the establishment of norms, of very quickly when someone first decides that they want to bring out their misogynist statements, their sexist, their racist statements, whatever it may be, to very quickly, and before that person has entrenched their opinion in that respect, inform them that that behavior is not acceptable. And while I don't want to center the people who are abusive, I would like to believe that a large segment of people who engage in abusive behavior could be persuaded not to do so. Certainly there will always be a hardcore of extreme misogynists, but when they are the exception and they are so much more extreme and there's less of a spectrum from the people who really genuinely hate women rather than the people who merely want to compete to show how much they hate women, it's easier to deal with that smaller body of more extreme work. And certainly the things that I'm suggesting look a lot like moderation, but they can also look like community encouragement. If you have a comment section and you have people who show up regularly, who aren't necessarily your journalists or your editors or so forth, but who, when there's the spark of a hateful storm, can quickly shut down that conversation, not necessarily by removing comments or downvoting them or hiding them in some way, but by adding a prominent response saying, we don't do that here, we don't say that here, then it's not just that person who's the audience. That person may be a terrible human being and choose to continue posting and have some of their things removed, but many other people who see that, who might be considering, well, do I want to be a troll in this case, see that that behavior is unwelcome in this community and choose not to. Again, certainly the least important person by far in any case of abuse is the person engaging in the abuse. But if that presents a mechanism by which abuse as a whole can be reduced and its impact in general can be reduced as a good practice, I think that's a valuable approach to consider in tandem with these other technical approaches that have been sort of considered and discussed as we've gone along here.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, two more, and then we go back to the panelists. Please.
I just wanted to get us a little bit back on the track. We're talking about a very specific type of abuse, not abuse in general. I don't think that anyone slums and shames and sluts women out by mistake or because he's guided. I think this is a very deliberate, a very particular type of attack on women journalists and should be handled separately or with more care. I'm also very happy that we have Google person here. And I think that, but I understood that there will be another conference about intermediaries. I think that's an extremely important part of this conversation, and yeah, welcome aboard. I think that story about all working together and different actors particularly includes intermediaries and commercial companies. And I just want to remind us all that company policies are not public policies necessarily, and we should be aware of that. Code neutrality or technology neutrality and law neutrality are two different things. This is also something that we should discuss. I don't think that this is not maybe the occasion to raise that issue, but I remember the story about the YouTube video about actual rape, 16 minutes of actual rape that took more than 2 months to be taken off because Google was claiming that, YouTube was claiming that it's a controversial content, actual rape. So I'm not just talking about company policies. Also, again, this is not the point, but Google's policies against the right to be forgotten also includes the fact that commercial stakes of the company do not always coincide with the public policy on that issue, and that with open statements of the company, you can also, well, maybe not instruct, but prime consumers into a certain direction. So maybe in the next round of debates, more discussion with commercial companies will also be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it seems that we need much more conversations on this. Judith, yes.
Thank you. I just thought I think the panel brought up some really good points about how do we start addressing these urgent issues now, especially since working with international mechanisms or regional mechanisms or states tend to be slower, or even working with companies, that is, and the issues are very urgent, especially for the individual. Something that Article 19 has started doing, and this is something that I think media houses can do, or even individual journalists pushing forth this process with other journalists as well, without having the institutional backing, is to start really developing security protocols and making it very clear. So it could be an informal one, or it could be a formal one from the media house, or it could be a formal one from an NGO. But a situation happened in Malaysia that we addressed, and it happened in, I believe, March of this year, where a female journalist put a video out commenting on the potential passing of Islamic Penal Code, and she got completely harassed, and in 24 hours it went viral nationally, where religious leaders were even responding to it, and she was incredibly frightened. And so our response to that, and it was late, right, because it already happened. So the encouragement is that it has to be done before any kind of harassment begins. So initiate it now, before the first online abuse comes into a feed. And so the key elements of a security protocol that we do at Article 19 is first, what is the likelihood of a threat happening? So if you were to write this report, what is the likelihood of something happening? And then the second element is the impact. So the likelihood of I don't know, a tweet saying really mean things is probably very likely, but the impact's quite low. Or maybe an email threatening to release personal information or personal photos, maybe it's not as likely, but the impact is extremely high. And that helps you to balance and understand the level of threats and the response that are needed. And then the next element that you need is escalation points. So maybe point one is lots of comments on a feed saying subtle yet very aggressive things. And then the first escalation point could be a text message, or the first escalation point can be it becomes direct, so it's an email, or a direct message within Twitter, or something along those lines. So there's an escalation point that then requires a different level of action. And then from there, then you have to identify responders. So who within your social network, or who within your media house, or your NGO, or your alliance of journalists will respond once that escalation point happens. So for example, in Malaysia, when we did this, we really laid it out. So we said to her, okay, the minute that you get a text message, or the minute you get an email, let us know, because that's escalation point one. And then I will respond first as the first responder, and then I will contact these people in my organization. And we also had people on standby. So we informed the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, so he was aware of what was happening. And we informed Malaysian lawyers, so that way if the escalation point ever reaches that very high level, we are ready. So there isn't that time lag and that delay. And I think that all of these elements are necessary and something that groups can do now. We don't have to wait for institutional backing in order to start doing that. And I think that the difficulty with this is it puts the onus on the journalist and the individual to protect themselves first and to build these networks. But I think it's essential while we work on other mechanisms and protection. Anyway.
Thank you very much for that. We need to close this panel, which was amazingly interesting, and in order to try and really wrap up all the very interesting recommendations that have been made throughout this afternoon, I'm going to ask the panelists to say one final point in one or two sentences what you believe was the most important point that has been made today, or a new one. Thank you. Brittany.
Okay, one or two sentences. Yeah. Sorry in advance. As for this YouTube situation that you mentioned, I can't comment about a specific URL or a specific instance of something bad happening on YouTube, or some video that stayed up far too long that sounds like a clear violation of our policy and it should have been taken down more quickly. there's nothing more to be said about that, I think. We're working harder and faster than ever before to deal with the queue of the flags that we're getting, and to deal with the fact that we want people to understand not to use our platform for that kind of purpose in the first place. I think there are two paths of redress in that form. Like, we want people to not come to YouTube with that content in the first instance, and so there's this work stream of user education that has to happen. And then on the flip side of that, we need to be able to deal with the flags much faster. Flagging volume, how we deal with the queue on the back end, all that kind of stuff is really hard work, and we're doing a better and better job. But I'm not going to pretend that, you know, there's not content on YouTube that doesn't belong there. We can have a totally separate conversation about platform regulation and intermediary liability regimes and all of these kinds of things, which, you know, are in my opinion, much less interesting than talking about the topic today, so I'll save it for later. But just to say that, you know, the platform is not perfect, but we work really hard to maintain a vibrant and open community where people can post anything they want. If it's a video of you playing with your cat, if it's a video of you saying something controversial and it requires a review, it doesn't matter. The point is that for some kinds of content, the vast majority of content, we want it. We want people to post it on our platform. We want people to feel that they can come to YouTube and participate openly and freely. The last point that I think I want to make is just picking up on this idea about roles and responsibilities. I think the core of all of these random arguments that I've made today is just that Google is clearly implicated in and has a clear stake in the current state of affairs. And I think this is one, the current state of affairs is one itself that I think we all could agree needs to be disrupted. Whether that's in the form of more robust research, whether it's updated things like comment moderation, I don't know what that is. But from my perspective overall, we need to be very, very careful about what we're asking platforms to do. And we need to keep really carefully in mind all the other sorts of legal and regulatory constraints that platforms have and protections that they have in place, so as to not, you know, be making requests to them that run contrary to these other values and these other pieces of law. Creating more restrictive spaces online, as Judy said before, I think is a really difficult conversation, and one that I think deserves a lot more attention. The answer to bad content is not to have less bad content, it's to create more good content, which is why I think counter-speech is so important, and why I think YouTube needs to remain an open space, because you have to flood YouTube with good content. The bad stuff is always going to be there. There's this fantasy myth that the internet was this clean, beautiful place and it's somehow been taken over by trolls. That's just not true. The internet was a piece of garbage to begin with, and we've been able to, sorry, to be frank, but we've been able to make it into something really beautiful and really wonderful and great, and people can make a lot of money and do really amazing, cool things. But the point is that, you know, we have to work hard at keeping that. That's proactive and positive and pushing forward. It's not like we're just trying to harken back and roll back into something that never existed in the first place. And that's it. Okay.
Thank you so much for that. Alana.
I also will try to speak quickly. A couple of days ago, the PBS NewsHour, which is a news program in the United States, aired a story about girls who were learning to code. And they were all younger than 15, and something that kind of came out of the story that wasn't the original purpose of it was that they all had experienced some kind of harassment online. And one of them even talked about how she never went online now unless it was under a boy's name. So she assumed a pseudonym. She was probably 12 years old and was talking about how she had received so many harassing comments when she went to play games online, to talk about coding, to exist in an online space, that she had just assumed a pseudonym, a boy's personality, no longer received harassing comments, and that was the way that she operated. And the others, you know, had similar stories to share. And I think the reason why this is important and why I'm sharing it is because I think it's really important for us to continue to have these conversations, to take this problem really seriously and to address it in a substantive way before the problem becomes so baked into the way women approach their interaction online, adapting and coming up with their own solutions, and kind of committing subterfuge against themselves, that we just accept it universally, and that it's no longer a problem and we no longer talk about it, and women no longer complain when they're harassed online because they found their own workarounds. And I think that would be a really dangerous problem to have, and certainly a really dangerous future for the online frontier. So I think we really need to take the things that we're talking about and all of these great action plans that we've come away with today very seriously. Again, I keep harping on the baseline, but I just think it's so important to have data because we can deny the severity and effect of this problem if we don't fully understand it. And I think if we're going to deal with this in a responsible way, in a way that really addresses the issue and has substantive results, then we really need to understand it. We need to collect data. We need to know how and why this happens. I think that the idea about engaging harassers is a really interesting one, and I think certainly that's something we should look at as well. Instead of isolating that community, which I think will only make it worse, I think that we need to engage them and figure out, what's the intent. I think the Lindy West story is a really good example of how when a troll was confronted directly, he immediately backed off and sent a note of apology after saying these horrible vitriolic things and engaging for weeks, almost full time, in harassing this woman. He then backed off when confronted with the effects of that. And I think that's a really important story and something that might happen more often if we took a more proactive approach. Also thinking about how to respond, how to shape organizational policy, what other regulations are put in place, where law enforcement's role is in this, if it exists at all. And I also want to reiterate that this problem spans demographics. It especially affects women who are minority voices, who are in a religious or ethnic minority already, and it silences their voices. And I think that also is a really dangerous place to be. And I think that we really need to understand the trauma and the fear that comes along with all of this. And we need to work together because I think all too often when there are cases of harassment, responsibility is just kind of passed around like a hot potato. And we really all need to take responsibility because this is not someone's responsibility if we're working in this sphere. Like, this problem belongs to all of us, no matter what sector you're working in. If you're a journalist, if you're a media organization, if you're an online platform, if you're an online publisher, if you're a media support group, if you're an international aid group, if you're an intergovernmental body, like, this is all of our problem. We all need to take responsibility for it and tackle it in the way that we can. And I think that if we work on that across platforms, then we can have a real effect.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And Sarah?
There's been a lot of really great proposals bouncing around, from technological innovations to more proactive moderation, more responsibility at news organizations. I particularly like the description of the security protocol that Judy Tang put out. In extreme cases, I think that would be extraordinarily helpful. But I wanted to end the session with a caveat. Whenever a proposed remedy comes up, we should be asking, does this chill speech at large or even harm already marginalized groups? So I think a particularly harmful notion that often repeats, I'm happy to say that it did not repeat very much today, is the idea that anonymity is the problem and that anonymity must be removed. I think that, first of all, anonymity is a very complex notion. There's varying levels of anonymity. You can be totally anonymous. Your content might be a one-off that's unrelated to everything else. You may have a persistent identity that is nonetheless not linked to your real name. And then there's this idea that actually a real name is, of course, a social construct. There are government papers associated with a name that that is associated with your physical person in a filing cabinet somewhere, but that's not necessarily the name that you go by or the name that you're identified with or really the most important name in your life. And so in fact, real name policies or these kinds of policies that are targeted at piercing through anonymity turn out to be painfully misguided. Not only do they end up targeting people who have, for instance, like strange names. So people on Facebook, under the Facebook real names policy, if you have a name that does not seem to be real to whoever is looking at your account, if you just have a strange name because you're part of an ethnic minority, your account might be taken down. If you're part of the drag community or if you're transgender, your account might be taken down. There are journalists who go under pen names who've had their accounts disabled. And so I think that it's really, this seems like an absurd consequence, of course. Surely no one intended for this to happen. We say, oh, this anonymous troll is bad and he's hiding behind a mask and that's what enables him. And when we say it so loosely like this, I think that it's very, very possible to build out a policy based on that ends up harming a lot of people, ends up chilling speech, and ends up having terrible consequences. So before we build a sword to go after people who are certainly harmful, you have to imagine how the sword can be turned against journalists and speakers who are quite vulnerable and also need to be protected in order to enhance pluralism on the internet.
Thank you very much for that. And I think I would like to thank the panelists for the wonderful recommendation and thank everybody for your interventions. Thank you.